Have another session. I think they are the best speaker ever from this session. So I would like to start with the first one. With Alin, Christoph, Cucu. It's also a friend and philosopher. He made his PhD at the University of Lausanne. He's now a lecturer there. He's author of several peer-reviewed papers on mind and body interaction. And also he's co-editor of an anthology entitled Religious Hypothesis and the Study of Human Nature. This book appeared this summer in Romanian language. He's also wrote a lot of journal papers. One of was awarded as the best paper prize of the Mind and Matter Society. He also won 3 Templeton grants in Romania for a research project at the intersection of theology, philosophy, and science. And his research is focused on the soul and body dualism, the Christian worldview versus the modern worldview, and the philosophy of C.S. Lewis. Today, he will present us a paper called C.S. Lewis as Philosopher on the Significance of Matter. Please.
I should mention that Marius was also part of the team and also a co-author for that anthology that we issued as part of a Templeton project. As you may or may not know, C.S. Lewis was, among others, also a philosopher. Maybe not technically, but he certainly did the work of a philosopher. So de jure, he was not a philosopher maybe, but de facto, he was even a very good philosopher, I think. And so I'm going to examine an argument that he's giving in the book, The Problem of Pain. And in good philosopher's custom, I'm going to criticize this argument. But in a Christian spirit, again, I'm trying to do that in a constructive manner so as to bring out the best of this argument, but also point out where things are maybe a bit shaky. So let's get started. First, I want to put the argument in the context of the book. So that's the book. It's the HarperCollins edition, I think, from 1960 that I'm using. So the problem of pain is basically the classical theodicy problem. And philosophically speaking, it consists of a triad of 3 propositions that are being considered incompatible with one another, at least by the defenders of the problem, let's say, by the detractors of the existence of God. The 3 propositions are: God is omnipotent, God is omnibenevolent, God is perfectly good, and suffering exists. And the idea is that all 3 of them cannot be true at the same time, so one of them has to go. That's the idea. And of course, the defense, an intellectual defense of the existence of God, of the Christian God, must deal with those 3 propositions. And obviously, the 3rd proposition cannot go, because suffering obviously exists. Who can deny that? So it's either God is not omnipotent, or he's not perfectly good. And so what C.S. Lewis is offering here is an intellectual defense of the existence of God in a world that contains suffering. It's not a pastoral dealing with the problem. So that's very important to keep in mind. So again, what he does is he addresses the 2 first propositions. And the one that we're going to focus on now in this talk is the first proposition, the omnipotence of God. So, okay. And he does that in chapter 2 of the book. The rest is dedicated to the other proposition and, of course, then to making sense of suffering in the light of the existence of God. But the argument he's giving is in the context of chapter 2, in the context of divine omnipotence. Okay, right. So what does divine omnipotence mean? Of course, a first approximation would be to say God is able to do anything. But what does it really mean? Because you could come up with examples like, can God lift a stone that is so heavy that he can't lift it himself? Can God create a stone that is so heavy that he can't lift it himself? Things like that. And the point is, and that Lewis makes also in his argument, is that things that are logically contradictory, that are not logically possible, they're no detraction from God's omnipotence, they're just nonsense. He says, nonsense remains nonsense even if it is predicated upon God. So this is not a limitation to God's omnipotence, it's simply nonsense. But that's widely acknowledged, that logically impossible things cannot be, well, God cannot be asked to perform them. Okay, but Lewis wants to go further. He asks, or he says, that not even omnipotence could create a society of free souls without at the same time creating a relatively independent and inexorable nature. Well, the way nature, and by that he means basically the physical cosmos, is created, that's not a logical necessity. So we can imagine other worlds that are simply different from ours, where gravity is different, for example, where water has a different structure. We could at least imagine them. We don't know whether there is any necessity behind it, but if there is one, it doesn't seem to be a logical one. That's his point. But still, he wants to show that God could not have created another world, a distinctly different world, without giving up something very central, namely a society of free souls. Let's see how he argues for that. 3 arguments he gives. Well, it's 2 actually. One consists of 2 steps. So the first one is his thesis that matter, that is the physical cosmos, enables communication between souls. That's his first argument why God had to create this world. So, and it's a 2-step argument actually. The first step is, in order to know themselves, souls must be able to distinguish between themselves and others and to interact with others. Just in parentheses, it may sound a bit strange, but obviously he is a dualist, which means that he believes that human beings are body and soul, 2 separate entities, as it were, that are combined, but that can come apart. So he assumes that it's possible that disembodied souls exist. It's not taken for granted, especially not in modern-day philosophy, but that's his position, obviously. Otherwise, his thought experiment wouldn't work at all. The second step is that souls cannot distinguish themselves from others or interact with them if they do not inhabit a material world. So, distinction between self and others, that's one part, and in order to do that, souls need to inhabit a material world. Let's see whether this argument works. If either one of the 2 steps doesn't work, then this part of his argument stands on shaky ground. So are others required for self-knowledge? He writes, there is no reason to suppose that self-consciousness, the recognition of a creature by itself as a self, can exist except in contrast with an other, a something which is not the self. Well, that's a strong claim. He says there's no reason to suppose that this is possible. What he means there by self-consciousness is, well, this is the way I read him, is a technical term that philosophers of mind call reflexive self-consciousness, which means the ability to have the self as an object of thought. So we can have all sorts of things as an object in our minds. We can have other people, places, abstract objects, whatever. But we can also think about ourselves, as it were. So this is reflexive self-consciousness. Animals arguably don't have that. So are others needed for that? So what I'm talking about here is not a deep, meaningful, rich account of selfhood, of self or of identity. It's the metaphysical prerequisite for even thinking about oneself. So it's a very technical term here. Right now I'm disenchanting scholarship here a bit. The point is that it's not so clear. So there are two schools in philosophy of mind. The one is, two representative of it would be Avicenna, a Muslim philosopher from the 10th century, I think, with his flying man thought experiment, or René Descartes with his cogito argument. They hold that in order to know oneself, or at least others don't play any role in those settings. The flying man is a man that is created in mid-air, who falls indefinitely, who has no knowledge of his body, no proprioception, as it were, and no external world that differs, that in a way that changes, so that he could make out any changes. He just has his own self-consciousness. And Avicenna holds this man can be conscious of himself and even conscious of what he is, what kind of substance he is, namely an immaterial substance, a soul. And Descartes famously said, cogito ergo sum. So I just need to think, and I know that by thinking, I know that I exist. The other school is arguably represented by Edmund Husserl, and also developmental psychology, which gives us some hints that very little infants need other people, their parents of course, especially, to develop something like concepts which also contain the concept of self. So according to that line of thought, others are needed as a metaphysical prerequisite if you want to even develop a concept of self. The problem is how to adjudicate between those two schools. On the one hand, we have thought experiments, which can never be reproduced in any empirical manner. On the other hand, we have something empirical, but who would dare to do any such experiments with infants? That's of course morally reprehensible. To withhold them the care of adults and to see how they would develop. Of course, it's not being done. Luckily, fortunately, it's not being done. So we don't really know which one is true. The point is that Lewis may be right, but his claim is a bit too strong, I think, here. So the second step is that matter is required for communication between souls. Let's see if that can hold its ground. So I have these icons of ghosts, to represent souls in a way. So he writes, if your thoughts and passions were directly present to me, like my own, without any mark of externality or otherness, how should I distinguish them from mine? Well, that sounds compelling. But again, we have to ask, is it true? So the idea would be that if there were just souls, without bodies, without a physical world, a space in which we are so accustomed to, could they even distinguish between their own thoughts and others? So a thought would appear in the soul's mind. Would it know that it's its own thought as opposed to another's thought? And Lewis says no, they couldn't distinguish between those thoughts. But that works, of course, only if there is no distinction mark between one's own thoughts and the thoughts of others. And he also weakens his own argument right away by pointing out that people who have, let's say, God inserts a thought in someone's mind, and he says, or Satan for that matter, he says, do those people, can they discern those thoughts as being inserted from outside? And he says, in most cases, people are not able to identify those thoughts as external, but not in all cases. So it's more a matter of probability or maybe of skill, of discernment. There is no metaphysical necessity to that. So it seems to be possible to distinguish, even according to his own words, to distinguish between one's own thoughts and inserted thoughts. Or even schizophrenics, they claim to have thoughts from others inserted into their own minds. The point is not whether that's veridical. The point is that they can make a distinction between their own thoughts and allegedly foreign thoughts. So there maybe is a flavor, let's say, a flavor to foreign thoughts that don't have this sense of ownership that my own thoughts have. The point again is that his argument is not as strong as he thought it would be. So I draw an intermediate conclusion, which is that it's not so clear that self-consciousness requires a counterpart, an other. It may be reasonable, but we don't know for sure. And neither is it clear that communication between souls requires an external world. It may be possible even if just souls existed. Now, come to his second argument. He writes, if matter is to serve as a neutral field, it must have a fixed nature of its own. And that seems right. So, but note that this already presupposes that matter exists, a physical universe exists. It just now tells us how this must be structured, what nature it must have in order to serve the purpose it's supposed to serve. Well, that seems really spot on, because now, how do we communicate with each other? We send messages, right? But we depend on, barring telepathy, maybe some people are able to do that, and by the previous argument, maybe it's even possible, but it's not the regular thing we observe. So we depend on nature, either sound waves, light, paper, computers, whatever. And we kind of encode messages. So the information you want to transpose is being encoded in something material and then decoded by the recipient. By, let's say, a code called a function f of psi. Psi is the message. Now, the recipient must be able to rely on this f remaining constant, because otherwise his decoding works at one time, and at another time it fails to work. So communication would be impossible. We would never know how to decode the messages. But fortunately, matter remains constant. So my computer doesn't morph into, I don't know what, a blob or something, so that I couldn't use it. It just stays the way it is. And sound waves don't change their nature. Otherwise, you couldn't listen to my talk now. So that seems right. I'm drawing another intermediate conclusion. Nature must be mind-independent and stable for communication between embodied souls to work. Mind-independent means that it must not bend to our wills. So the moment I'm able to alter reality, I don't know if there are any Marvel fans among you. There's one scene in Avengers Infinity War where Star-Lord tries to shoot Gamora, and his gun morphs into a bubble gun. Because Thanos, he controls reality. So reality bends to Thanos' will at that point. But if reality were such, then things like even shooting people, if that's my intention, wouldn't work anymore. And neither would any good deeds work anymore, because reality doesn't remain stable. It bends to someone else's will. And of course stable, so it must not oscillate over time. That of course applies only if a nature is already in place. And it leaves open the question, why do we then need a material world in the first place? Because we haven't still figured out what is the necessity there. Why did omnipotence have to create it in such a way? Or why did you have to create a nature in the first place? And so I'm coming to the part where I think the most important, crucial takeaway lies in his argument. The world is a space for meaningful horizontal moral choices. By horizontal, I mean between human beings, not between humans and God. So what is matter for? Lewis writes, if matter has a fixed nature and obeys constant laws, not all states of matter will be equally agreeable to the wishes of a given soul, nor all equally beneficial for that particular aggregate of matter, which he calls his body. So for some people it might be good to snatch away a piece of cake, but then some others will lack it, right? To give a very banal example. But you have it, you can cite other examples where it's much more incisive how we use matter. And he goes on, this is very far from being an evil. On the contrary, it furnishes occasion for all those acts of courtesy, respect, and unselfishness by which love and good humor and modesty express themselves. So, and this is now the pivotal point. Matter, the way it is, opens up the possibilities of meaningful moral decisions, those acts of courtesy, respect, and unselfishness. But of course, it also opens up the possibility of evil, even of gratuitous evil. But that's the deal. You can't give creatures free will without opening up the possibility of evil to happen, but also, of course, of good to happen. Good cannot be done without free will. So, a world in which just souls existed, well, according to Lewis, it wouldn't even be a world, because a world already sneaks in the notion of a space or something, a container. No significant good or evil could be done, except perhaps, I don't know, transmitting insults or something like that. But those souls couldn't kill each other, right? They're immortal in that sense. Nor could they ostracize each other. It's not possible to lock someone out. If you can just insert your thoughts into another soul's mind, then there's no way to socially ostracize anybody. But in a world like ours, where we have bodies, we live in a physical space, significant good or evil can be done. Killing or healing, robbing or lavishing goods on other people, social ostracization can lock people out, or you can invite them in and have fellowship. All that is possible because we're embodied. So I'm coming to my final conclusion. So the first two arguments of Lewis are a bit shaky, so they leave too much room for attacks, for refutations. But what is sure, what is certain, in my view, is that the way the world is makes the lives of its embodied participants interesting and meaningful and exciting in a way, because it makes significant moral choices possible. And I think that is not only the most stable thing he could say in the course of that argument, but it's also the relevant takeaway for the context of the whole book, because he wants to defend basically the fact that free will is a good that God could not have given to us without also giving us the possibility of doing evil. And as we have seen, significant evil is not possible without this material world that we have and without embodiment. Thank you.
Thank you, Alin. I'm sure you have questions, so you'll be time for that. Just note the questions. We are getting ready for a new paper, so I invite Professor Melody Green. She already had several presentations for the kids in Iași, also primary school, I've heard, also to a Christian library. I think the greatest in Iași. And she decided to have the same presentation here to see if we can understand what the primary school. No, it was a joke. Okay. but I want to present you first. Professor Melody Green is the Dean and the Associate Professor of Christianity and Culture at the Urbana Theological Seminary. She earned her PhD from Illinois State University in English Studies with a specialization in literature for children and young and adolescents. She teaches courses on different Christian authors like C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, MacDonald, and others, and a variety of topic courses such as Christianity and Christian literature and so on. For today, she chose the very easy paper, C.S. Lewis and Jacques Derrida, a closer look. So we invite you.
You may regret that too, but thank you. Before I start, I am going to give you an advance warning. I have asthma. If I start coughing, the good news is it's not contagious. The bad news is it may steal some of our time. So here we go. It's not uncommon for C.S. Lewis scholars to set up a dichotomy, or a binary, if you will, in which C.S. Lewis is presented as the champion of authorial intent, absolute truth, and meaning itself, while Jacques Derrida is presented as a nihilistic opponent of these, working toward the destruction not only of truth, but also of language itself. Other scholars, however, have taken the opposite approach, arguing that there are important things that Lewis and Derrida share. Lewis and Derrida definitely work with many of the same ideas, and several of their ideas interact with each other in what I think are very interesting ways, so we're going to look at just a few of those. The first one to talk about, of course, is the name that most people have associated with him, the term deconstruction. Derrida first presented the concept of deconstruction in a lecture called Structure, Sign, and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences. While he talked about it, he never named it in that lecture. And then he followed it quickly with 3 books on the same topic, Writing and Difference, Voice and Phenomenon, and Of Grammatology. In these texts, Derrida explains over and over and over again that all Western thought has a center. Whether that center is God or science or justice or whatever is really irrelevant. Meaning is shaped by whatever that center is. And each center marginalizes something else. These centers shift over time. Okay. In these shifts, the structure of thought does not change. It just means something new, often the old center, is now the margin. It's now being marginalized. Within the binaries, as the centers shift, the context changes the meanings of the words. Derrida argues that we are all caught in these binaries. We do not need to create new centers. Instead, we need to break out of the binaries that we are already caught in to see what other options exist for meaning. The meaning of words, the meaning of life. This breaking out of the binaries are what Derrida calls deconstruction. A concrete example of how this works might be this. In some parts of the world, the Christian church, whether Orthodox, Catholic, or something else, has been, for at least several hundred years, the center that gave meaning to thought and language. But in the last, let's say 150 years, in different places, at different times, in different ways, that center shifted from a form of Christianity to what C.S. Lewis called scientism, the belief that silence is the route to a better future. What did I say? Wow, thank you. I didn't even catch myself saying that. I think that's a better paper than the one I wrote. Wow. Thank you for catching that. Now I have no idea where I was. Science is the better route. You guys are so good. I don't even need to read this to you. I'll let you do it. When Christianity was the center, science was often marginalized. But in places where science has become the center, Christianity is now marginalized. And there are writings that are working right now to break out of that Christianity-science binary. One example would be The nuclear scientist Ian Hutchinson wrote a book called Can a Scientist Believe in Miracles? An MIT professor answers questions on God and science. Or Francis Collins's The Language of God, a scientist presents evidence for belief. So those books are actually trying to break out of that binary, finding a third way. While some Lewis scholars, you notice I'm not naming anybody, but if you want to ask me later, I'll tell you who. Some Lewis scholars feel threatened by deconstruction. Others have actually argued that on this topic, Lewis and Derrida are in complete agreement. For example, Kyoko Yuasa, in her book C.S. Lewis and Christian Postmodernism, argues that Lewis's fiction breaks the binaries inherent in modernist thought, stepping out of them to provide a new paradigm foreign to the modernist binary, which favors science, materialism, and atheism. Another example would be David C. Downing, the co-director of the Marianne E. Wade Center at Wheaton, which is, many people have mentioned this place this weekend. It's a study center focused on C.S. Lewis and others. David Downing explains in his article, C.S. Lewis Among the Postmodernists, that when he first read Derrida, it felt very familiar because he'd already encountered all those same ideas in the literary scholarship of C.S. Lewis. Downing explains this by comparing structure, sign, and play in the discourse of human sciences to Lewis's Meditations on a Tool Shed. Both essays, he explains, point out that there is no way to objectively look at something. Lewis says you can only stand outside one experience by stepping inside another. Derrida would explain that as having simply exchanged one center for another. Lewis says, if all inside experiences are misleading, then we are always misled. Derrida says that this exchange of centers makes language subjective. Even though they are thinking in similar ways, there is one obvious difference. This is what Downing has noticed. Downing goes on to explain that Lewis develops these ideas in an essay called Bulverism. This essay begins by explaining that Freud and others of his kind dismissed Christianity because it was ideologically tainted. But Lewis explains that Freud and company have that same problem. No system of thought can be viewed from any other location than from within another system of thought. Because of all of this, all systems of thought are tainted ideologically. So any system of thought cannot be rejected on grounds that every system of thought shares. Downing uses some other essays of Lewis's, such as De Description Temporium, to explore the connections between Lewis's writing and Derrida's. But I want us to look just at one more sample from Downing. In The Discarded Image, Lewis explains that entire models of understanding how the universe works change over time. In this work, Lewis describes what could be called the medieval worldview so that readers of medieval texts will better understand such things as the medieval beliefs about the relationships between planets and humans, and how they shaped daily life, or what it meant that the earth was believed to be the center of the universe. In order to make clear what he's doing, however, Lewis's readers must understand that these structures we use to view the universe do not reflect the real universe, but are instead models. Whether they are ours or the medieval ones, they are still models. In Lewis's own words, no model is a catalog of ultimate realities, and none is a mere fantasy. Each is a serious attempt to get in all the phenomena known at a given period, and each succeeds in getting in a great many. But also, no less surely, each reflects the prevalent psychology of an age almost as much as it reflects the state of that age's knowledge. He goes on to explain that our own model of understanding the world will eventually be replaced by another, and no model can ever reflect absolute reality. They are based less on facts than what Lewis calls mental tempers. Richard Kearney, in an essay called Dialogue with Jacques Derrida, points out that identifying the binary structures of one society is really only the first part of deconstruction. The second part is what Derrida described as an openness towards the other. This, according to Kearney, is about stepping out of the self, being willing to understand the perspectives of other people. especially those who are completely outside the set of binaries that the individual is trapped in. Lewis sees this happening through reading. In an experiment in criticism, Lewis describes reading as a fulfillment of the desire to see from other people's perspectives. We want to see with other eyes, to imagine with other imaginations, to feel with other hearts as well as with our own, he says. Lewis goes on to explain it this way. In reading great literature, I become 1,000 men and yet remain myself. Like the night sky in the Greek poem, I see with myriad eyes, but it is still I who see. Here, as in worship, in love, in moral action, in knowing, I transcend myself, and am never more myself than when I do. One cannot deny that Derrida and Lewis disagree on several points. The most important being that Lewis acknowledges that even if our models can never fully present an accurate understanding of the totality of things, there is still an absolute truth out there. Derrida does not have the same assurance. But that does not mean, as some have said, that his systems mean that nothing means anything. It does mean that we need to pay attention to why things mean what they mean. While there are many other ideas of Lewis's that interact with Derrida, our time constraints only allow us space to quickly touch on, I'll say, 3 more. So the first of these is the concept of wonder, and I'm going to be blunt right now. This is probably my weakest point, so you guys can fall asleep. In an essay called Derrida and the Philosophical History of Wonder, are you guys all asleep yet? They're not asleep. In an essay called Derrida and the Philosophical History of Wonder, Genevieve Lloyd admits that Derrida rarely uses the word wonder. But, she argues, the concept is central to much of what he is doing. To follow her argument, it's important to know that Lloyd argues that while Derrida rarely uses this word, Derrida does use a different, specific, philosophic term that means essentially the same thing. The word is aporia, which he describes as a sudden surprise of the soul, in which we are singularly exposed in our absolute and absolutely naked uniqueness. In experiencing aporia, or wonder, we are disarmed, delivered to the other. Ultimately, Lloyd explains, to Derrida, aporia, or this sense that she's calling wonder, is the ground for philosophical questioning and research. It is where all reason and thought begin. Like Derrida, Lewis only occasionally uses the term wonder, but unlike Derrida, many people have associated it with everything he's doing. And you can find blog entries, videos, articles, book titles, even songs based on Lewis's work that apply the word wonder to what he's doing. Now, some will even clarify that they are using that term wonder when Lewis himself would use the words enchantment or joy. Enchantment and joy are important concepts to Lewis. In his autobiographical book, Surprised by Joy, Lewis explains how, when he was a small child, a toy garden his brother made out of sticks and moss transported him into a unique state. From that time forward, the young C.S. Lewis searched out experiences that gave him that same sensation. Ultimately, however, his conversion to Christianity changed his relationship to that experience of joy. And he explains this at the end of Surprised by Joy. He says, "But what in conclusion of joy? For that, after all, is what this story has mainly been about. To tell you the truth, the subject has lost nearly all interest for me since I became a Christian. I cannot indeed complain, like Wordsworth, that the visionary gleam has passed away. I believe, if the thing were at all worth recording, that the old stab, the old bittersweet, has come to me as often and as sharply since my conversion as at any time of my life whatever. But I now know that the experience, considered as a state of my own mind, had never had the kind of importance I once gave it. It was valuable only as a pointer to something other and outer." For Lewis, like Derrida, that sense of wonder, that enchantment, that joy is not an end in itself, but points the person experiencing it to something else. For Derrida, it points to philosophy and the ever-changing other. For Lewis, it points to Christ. In Derrida's language, it could be said that in coming to Christ, Lewis stepped out of the binary of joy, not joy, into something or someone completely other. Before I go on to the next point of interaction between Lewis and Derrida, I would actually like us to step aside for a moment. As I'm looking at you guys, some of you are looking intrigued, some of you are looking a little skeptical. So we're going to play a game. I'm going to try to convince you a little bit better that Lewis and Derrida have some things in common, okay? So here's what you're going to do. I'm calling our game Lewis or Derrida. I'm going to read to you a quote. I'm not going to make you shout it out loud because I don't want you to embarrass yourself in front of other people if you guess wrong. But in your head, keep track. Decide to yourself if it was Lewis or Derrida who said it. At the end of the game, I will tell you who said each one, and you can count up your own scores, and you can reward yourself appropriately for how you won, okay? Okay, so the game is Lewis or Derrida. Here's our first quote. The thing presented to us in any poem is not, and never can be, the personality of the poet. Shall I read it a second time? The thing presented to us in any poem is not, and never can be, the personality of the poet. Okay, you got your answer? Good. Here's the second one. Whenever we have ancient poetry at all, there will be language which was commonplace to the writers, but which time has turned to beauty. Every work of art that lasts long in the world is continually taking on new colors, which the artist neither foresaw nor intended. Do you want me to read that one again? I'll read it again, why not? We got time, right? A couple minutes? Okay. Whenever we have ancient poetry at all, there will be language which was commonplace to the writers, but which time has turned to beauty. Every work of art that lasts long in the world is continually taking on new colors which the artist neither foresaw nor intended. Ready for the next one? Every perception is what it is by virtue of its context. That's a short one, I'll reread it. Every perception is what it is by virtue of its context. Here's the next one. The objects, then, which we contemplate in reading poetry are not the private furniture of the poet's mind. The mind through which we see them is not the poet's. If you ask whose it is, I reply, we have no reason to suppose that it is anyone's. This next one, I'm going to add a few words to the front just to give it the context. What we do encounter in reading is a mood, a mode of consciousness, created temporarily in the minds of various readers by the subjective qualities which certain words and ideas have taken on. Got that one? Okay, we've got one left. If the world is meaningless, then so are we. If we mean something, we do not mean it alone. If the world is meaningless, then so are we. If we mean something, we do not mean it alone. Got it? Okay, some of you may have already figured out where I was going with this. Every single one of those quotes was written by C.S. Lewis. In fact, they all come from the very first chapter that he wrote of the book The Personal Heresy, which was published in 1939, 8 years after his conversion to Christianity. This book is a series of essays. If you've never read The Personal Heresy, it is fascinating. It's a series of essays outlining an argument between C.S. Lewis and E.M.W. Tilliard, discussing whether or not a reader can really know what an author meant by what they wrote. So Lewis wrote that first chapter, that all of those quotes came from that chapter. Tilliard responds, Lewis writes back. Because the postmodern critics tend to talk about things such as the death of the author, and Derrida himself says there is nothing outside the text. There's been a tendency among some scholars to view Lewis, because he does believe ultimately in an absolute, they present him as the champion holding out for authorial intent in the face of postmodern thought. But you take those lines out of the context of the argument, and it sounds like he's doing the opposite. There are, and because of those lines, as we look at them, there are some problems with this idea that Lewis is the champion holding out for authorial intent. First, what they are presenting as his opposition is postmodern thought. It's not just a postmodern idea. It is older than postmodernism. The new critics were arguing that the text stands alone and we cannot know what the author meant decades before Derrida or any of the other postmoderns were saying the same thing. The second problem is this. It's a term that those of you who are in the field of English, you know this term. It is intentional fallacy. It is used to describe the erroneous idea that when we read, we get in touch with the mind of a writer. The term was coined by Wimsatt and Beardsley in an essay called The Intentional Fallacy, first published in 1946. They begin the essay by citing C.S. Lewis and E.M.W. Tilliard as groundbreaking scholars working on the idea that they call the intentional fallacy in their book, The Personal Heresy. It's the stance that Lewis is arguing against Tilliard, saying, we can know what an author meant. Of course we can. And Lewis is saying, I don't think it's that easy. Tilliard argued that when we read, we get in touch with the mind of a great writer. Lewis insisted that this is simply not the case, and said everything we just said, read out loud. The final topic I want to address is that they both wrote on forgiveness. In fact, they both wrote essays titled On Forgiveness. In these essays, Derrida and Lewis share the idea that forgiveness does not involve finding reasons or excuses for someone else's behavior. An excuse, they both argue, is simply accepting a reason, agreeing that forgiveness is not needed when there is an excuse because, bearing in mind the circumstances, no wrong has really been done. According to Derrida, genuine forgiveness only occurs when there is absolutely no excuse. The person who needs forgiveness has done something so blatant, so horrible, that the transgression cannot be swept away. In Derrida's mind, forgiveness under these circumstances is the only real forgiveness that can possibly exist. Unfortunately for Derrida, he argues that it is also an impossibility. To Derrida, the person who needs forgiveness cannot ever be forgiven. There is no hope in his essay on forgiveness. He says this. Derrida, in his essay called On Forgiveness, argues that forgiving and excusing are two very different things, just like Derrida does. He says they do not take the place of each other. But unlike Derrida, Lewis speaks from a position that acknowledges his own need for forgiveness. I find that when I think I am asking God to forgive me, I am often in reality, unless I watch myself very carefully, asking him to do something quite different. I'm asking him not to forgive me, but to excuse me. But there is all the difference in the world between forgiving and excusing. For Lewis, like Derrida, excusing someone ultimately means agreeing that the transgression was not really that person's fault. Therefore, it shouldn't be held against them. Therefore, there's really nothing to forgive. Being excused is ultimately the same as being declared not guilty. But forgiveness, for Lewis, must include an awareness of guilt. Lewis explains, if you had a perfect excuse, you would not need forgiveness. If the whole of your action needs forgiveness, then there was no excuse for it. Real forgiveness for Lewis understands that damage has been done, understands that the situation is ugly, and chooses reconciliation anyway. That, and only that is forgiveness, says Lewis. But where Derrida believes that true forgiveness is impossible, Lewis believes that this genuine forgiveness is something that we can always have from God when we ask for it. He also claims that to be a Christian means to forgive the inexcusable in you. To forgive the inexcusable, because God has forgiven the inexcusable in you. Where Derrida believed that real forgiveness is impossible, Lewis points out that forgiving the unforgivable is exactly what God has already done for us in Christ. Derrida's view of forgiveness ends in a place of despair. Lewis's view of forgiveness ends in hope, the hope of the gospel. And here is the ultimate difference between Lewis and Derrida's understanding of the world they found themselves in. Derrida believed that meaning is shaped by an endless chain of shifting binaries. In Derrida's world, there are no absolutes, only shifting centers that marginalize former centers. To Lewis, however, while he could agree that there are shifting centers within worldviews and paradigms, there is an absolute found, but it's found outside the structures. Most importantly, however, this absolute is not a concept, but a very real person. It is the person of Christ who has done the impossible and broken us out of the systems that trap us. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Melody. I would like to present our next speaker, Professor Karen Coates. She is a professor of education and director of the Center for Research in Children's Literature at the University of Cambridge. She holds a PhD in human sciences from George Washington University, and she had published a lot on diverse subjects, ranging from psychoanalytic theory to alphabet books to cognitive poetics to the development of the neoliberal subject in American children books to visual conceptual metaphors, and so on. She has given invited keynotes lecture in different countries as Sweden, Thailand, Russia, Taiwan, China, and Cambridge, USA, Romania, and so on. She is a recipient of a Howard Foundation Fellowship. She has been a research fellow at 2 seminars in Christian scholarship at Calvin College. And she had also been with Professor Melody to meet the Romanian children at primary and secondary school. Yeah. And we invite her to present us her paper, Staying with the Discarded Image. Please.
You know, one thing that wasn't on there, and I'm going to take full credit because that was such a brilliant paper, I was the director of Melody Green's dissertation. So. That's kind of how old I am, too. Okay. So I have a PowerPoint, I think.
You need what?
I have a PowerPoint.
Here.
Okay. Yeah. Push the big button?
Just wait.
Okay, when it appears there. Oh, there it is. Okay. I was at Illinois State then. Yeah, I'm retired from Illinois State. I also teach at Hollins University in the master's program of children's literature and also writing and illustrating for children. So busy, a lot of busy. I can go ahead and start. I can start by telling that even though I'm not nearly as expert on C.S. Lewis as y'all are, I hope you'll hear some resonances with what I'm going to say today. I'm hearing resonances all over the place. In fact, I'm like rewriting portions of my paper after listening to Alin's talk. So hopefully we'll have some good conversation afterward. But at the 2021 conference here, even though I'm not a huge expert on Lewis, I boldly put forth a thesis that Lewis seems to have shared with scholars of the Frankfurt School many of the critiques of the materialism that had emerged in the 19th century and become dominant in the 20th. And in that presentation, I went on to argue that despite their similar views about what had gone wrong with the modern world, what sets Lewis apart is that his ontological, epistemological, and soteriological assumptions are very different from those shared by the materialists of his day. So in this presentation, I propose a similar exercise of critical comparison, this time with what purports to be what people are calling a new attempt to transcend a reductive and mechanistic materialism that has trapped us moderns in what Lewis calls an evil enchantment. So I guess maybe I don't have, they say Coates 23 slides is what, I'm not very creative with titles on that. So just to give you an idea of how I got from the materialism of the critical theory to the new materialism of today. There we go. Okay, so you can see where I got my title, staying with the discarded image and the evil enchantments of new materialist theory, and then, of course, C.S. Lewis's discarded image. Okay. So several years ago, I was asked by two young colleagues, there we go, to contribute to a volume that would explore what they referred to as new materialist openings to children's literature studies. And I was somewhat confused by this request because I'd never positioned myself as any kind of materialist, and I didn't know what I could contribute to this topic. I was even more surprised to see my work quoted with approval in an article that they had written to promote an embrace of new materialist concepts. Apparently, they saw something in my work that I didn't. And I do build some of my theoretical essays around stories about real children in my life, and I've sometimes written about love and the experience of being the mother of a disabled child, which requires learning to understand nonverbal communication and reading meaning into material circumstances. So maybe that was it. So, because I do what people tell me to do, I read around in the key texts and critiques of new materialist thinkers such as Karen Barad, Donna Haraway, Jane Bennett, Rosie Berdati. You can see some of their titles on there. And I became a very single-minded and boring conversationalist among my colleagues, always turning any discussion to new materialist claims about the agency of objects, the need to decenter and dismantle human exceptionalism, whether we really want or need to blur the distinction between adults and children, or between humans and non-humans, and what the ethical implications of such a flat ontology might be. I didn't like what I found. As a Christian and the mother of a disabled child, I believe in the radical equality and dignity of all human beings, and I locate human exceptionalism and responsibility in the fact that every single human is created in the image of God. I also believe in sin, rather than systems, as the source of injustice, and that the source of our sense of ethics and accountability comes from God, not from human knowledge, reason, culture, or material circumstances, but more on that later. So in the end, the chapter I wrote for the book was a skeptical and sometimes polemical objection to the embrace of many of the tenets of new materialism that the other chapters in the book explore and champion. I apologized. I told them they didn't need to include the article because it probably wasn't what they expected, but they chose to publish it as an afterword, hoping that it will inspire more thinking about the unresolved tensions inherent in a methodology that must be presented in a discursive form that seeks to dethrone language in favor of materiality, with texts written by named individual adults that aim to decenter adults and deny individuality, and that take as its object of study children's literature, which offers linguistic representations of the material world only made possible by the exceptionality of human imagination. So the first queries I put to the concept of new materialism regarded its claims to newness, but also its necessity and utility in light of other critical theories of the 20th and 21st century. I'm not grumpy about new theories, but as Chesterton wrote in What's Wrong with the World, In the modern world, we are primarily confronted with the extraordinary spectacle of people turning to new ideals because they have not tried the old. And that was where there was my book for this presentation, or this was my hook for this presentation. If I had found commonalities of the critique that Lewis had mounted against the materialism of his own time, what might he have had to say if I put him in conversation with something called new materialism? And as much as I find myself resisting and disagreeing with many of the claims of new materialist thinkers, I occasionally had to marvel at how close they come to the truths I do endorse and find consistent with what Jason M. Baxter calls Lewis's medieval mind, as well as his critiques of the reductive and mechanical materialism of the contemporary world. Either I'm fundamentally misunderstanding something, which is entirely possible, or, as Augustine suggests, any statements by those who are called philosophers, which happen to be true and consistent with our faith, should not cause alarm, but be claimed for our own use, as it were, from owners who have no right to them. These truths, however, are mostly structural. First and foremost, for instance, there is Lewis's severe critique and rejection of the materialism that emerged in the 19th century, perhaps most clearly articulated through the story he tells in That Hideous Strength. Like today's new materialists in that text and in The Abolition of Man, Lewis argues for what Rosie Braidotti calls a need for a qualitative and quantitative rethinking of what exactly is the basic unit of common reference for our species, our polity, and our relationship to other inhabitants of this planet. This is the quotation here. So, I'm okay that if the statements are true and consistent with our faith, but one of the key things for new materialist is a claim that for the ontological inseparability of agentially intra-acting components. Yeah, this is how they talk. But what that means is that we're not particles, we're waves. We need to think about the fact that we don't pre-exist our interaction with other elements in the environment. We are not ontologically separate beings. We are constantly intra-acting with the more than human world, and both we and those not more than human or non-human. They say more than human, which I think still centers humans, but that's just a terminological mistake, I think. But that those non-human components have their own agency. And when we they made up intra-act rather than interact to suggest that we become ontologically inseparable from them. So, we'll get on with it. So after all, if you write a book, so I think that even with this, I think that Lewis would agree that we need a qualitative and quantitative rethinking of what exactly is the unit of common reference for our species, especially after his critique of the way things were going in That Hideous Strength. We do need to do some rethinking about how we relate to other people. We need to do some rethinking about our ethics in how we relate to the natural world as well. So in his exploration of Lewis's medieval mind, Baxter perceptively and specifically links the notion of evil enchantment with Lewis's lament about the role of language, for instance, in the creation of a cosmic imaginary. Baxter summarizes Lewis's position by noting that the linguistic world we live in is peculiarly ill-suited to spiritual desire. New materialists similarly object to the inadequacies of the linguistic turn of post-structural theory, arguing instead for a material turn that foregrounds the co-constitutiveness of cultural discourse and materiality. We are creatures of both matter and language. But they want to foreground our materiality. Feminist new materialists, in particular, argue that the denial of the importance of embodiment and the material world and the enthronement of specific ways of using language as the key feature that makes humans exceptional have led to the abuses of power that have induced the climate crisis and all forms of social and environmental injustice. Drawing attention to the ways in which we're entangled with non-human entities and objects that exert their own forms of agency as we interact with them demands that we understand ourselves as assemblages of forces and materialities rather than self-regulating individuals. Now, in terms of a comparison, we might cautiously think, okay, so far so good. As such a reimagined version of materiality accords with how Lewis's own idea of how language and ethics are mutually constitutive, as well as how objects themselves must be conceived as something other and more than our subjective feelings toward them. This perspective thus verifies Lewis's concern that an overdependence on an impoverished, efficiency-driven, self-referential, and self-enclosed language system deadens our sensitivity to the natural world and our responsibility to others. But, as Donna Haraway famously notes in Staying with the Trouble, making kin with the Cthulhucene, and elsewhere, I think I got that right, it matters which stories tell stories, which concepts think concepts. In seeking to free the world from the dominance of anthropocentric ways of knowing through reason and argument, new materialists are participating in a story that Lyotard argues is one of the two great meta-narratives of the modern world. He calls it the emancipation narrative. Christopher Watkin locates the origin of that story in Exodus, when Moses repeatedly delivers the command of God to Pharaoh to let my people go. He points out, however, that modernity has really only taken up half of that narrative. That is, we constantly perceive new oppressions from which to free ourselves, but we neglect the second half of God's demand, so that they may worship me. Both Lewis and the new materialists feel the evil enchantments of modernity in different ways, but they diverge in the more important so that, both methodologically and ideologically. Lewis points readers to the poetry of the pre-modern period and provides figures in his own children's stories and adult fantasies that aim to both expose the evil enchantments and to weave spells against them. This is what Joe was talking about earlier, and other people have talked about this throughout the conference. His purpose, though, his so that, is to give readers license to admit, quote, this is from Baxter, their secret longings for a far-off country. These are not delusions or mere emotions without a proper referent. In other words, we need to qualitatively and quantitatively rethink what exactly is the basic unit of common reference for our species, our polity, and our relationship to other inhabitants of the planet, says Berdati, so that we might render to things their due esteem. And that's from Abolition of Man. This due esteem is not an equivalence to ourselves, to the natural world, or to God, but quoting Baxter, who quotes Thomas Traherne, the world is unknown until the value and glory of it is seen, till the beauty and the serviceableness of its parts is considered. When you enter into it, it is a happy loss to lose oneself in an admiration at one's own felicity and to find God in exchange for oneself, which we then do when we see him in his gifts and adore his glory. We can thereby escape, end quote. Okay. We can thereby escape, at least for a time, the evil enchantment through locating the proper object of worship and participating in a pre-modern worldview that, according to Lewis, was fundamentally anthroperipheral rather than anthropocentric. Now, by contrast, the proponents of new materialism undermine their own arguments and double down on the evil enchantments of contemporary language and ideas by repurposing words and coining new terms. Their books and essays are littered with terms like nature cultures, humanimal, ethico-onto-epistemology, diffraction, oddkin. One of Haraway's famous statements is, make kin, not babies. She's anti-child as well. Entanglement, assemblages, vibrant matter, responsibility, all terms that they hope, spectrality, I forgot about that one. All terms that they hope will challenge human exceptionalism while at the same time, and this is a quote from Abolition of Man, convince us that the good of man is to be found on this earth. The stories and concepts within which new materialist philosophies have developed are themselves entrapped in a frame of immanent naturalism, far from freeing us from the prison house of language in ways that would enable us to imagine and enact more ethical relationships and material interactions with other humans and the more than human world. Their own language play reinforces the primacy of human language as the agent of change. More importantly, perhaps, they attempt to intellectualize the inconsolable secret in each of us of our longing for communion with the living word. They want to de-God it, so to speak, by substituting an imagined ontological inseparability with whatever earthly components we are interacting with at any given moment. Now, we don't have world enough in time to fully engage with the points of comparison and contrast between new materialism and Lewis's discarded image, but I'd like to offer a quick overview of some of the basic assertions and assumptions that adherents to this emergent and tentacular philosophical stance appear to share, because I think you'll see both profound resonances as well as more profound divergences from the medieval and the modernist models. And I'm depending on you guys who just can quote Lewis right off the tops of their heads to figure out, to find some of the contradictions inherent in some of these tenets. The affect, though, so I'm using, the tenets are described by William E. Connolly. He has 10 shared tenets that describe how all the varieties of new materialist thinking position themselves against traditional and modernist views of ontology and epistemology. And what I want to point out, too, the affect of Connolly's writing, like the affect of my colleagues who, I was asking them, this stuff, a lot of it's illogical and doesn't make sense, and they're like, yeah, but it's beautiful. This could be so, they love, the enthusiasm is palpable in the way they love this theory. They desperately want these tenets to be true so that we can make the changes that they feel will re-enchant the world. So let's go through them a little bit. Some of the shared tenets, and I'm sharing them because it matters which stories tell stories and which concepts think concepts. First, they start with the Protean monism, which if we compare that to Alin's paper and what he said, they're trying to contrast, they're working against Cartesianism or mind-body or self-world dualism, but they're doing it by saying that life and mind evolve out of non-life that already contains traces of perceptual power, sensitivity, and proto-agency. That is, there's no creator, but aspects of mind are already distributed throughout matter. So it's what I would call in my field animistic thinking, which is how a lot of children, we're supposed to grow out of that, but we don't. We still think our computers are parts of our brain. But my question here is, why should we distinguish other beings, other entities from mine, and would it be better, the question they're kind of asking is, wouldn't it be better if we didn't make a distinction between humans and the rest of the world? If we focus more on our shared ontology rather than our distinctions. They also say that matter, this is again, Alan, I'm writing notes while you're talking, and this is one of the things where matter consists of energy-matter complexes that are dynamic and untotalizable. Matter's not stable in new materialist thinking. So in other words, there really can be no science because there's no absolute order, stability, or coherence in either matter or processes. They are fans of speculative realism, which is defined as differential periods of stability, being, and relative equilibrium in this or that zone while coming to terms with periods of real disequilibrium and becoming. So we live in a random universe. Nobody's controlling it, and we just, and it's not, again, there's no way to do science because there's nothing replicable, because there's no stability in what we find. So there are no orderly processes, for instance, or cycles of growth and decay. There's a Bible verse about that. Oops, I pushed the wrong one. Okay, we'll go forward again. Sorry. Okay, another is they want to extend subjectivity and agency well beyond the human estate, far into the biosphere. So there's no distinction between, since you have no creator, everybody's creatures. Creaturely life is indeterminate or indiscriminate. And so there's no such thing as humans that are distinct because they are made in the image of God. They alone are made in the image of God. So they're not a special type of creature. Everything should be regarded as, and this is that flat ontology. But meanwhile, you should have an ethic of cultivation. But that ethic of cultivation is not derived from a higher source or even a transcendental subject. Again, no God here, but rather based on our manifold entanglements with non-human processes. The good of the world is to be found, or the good of man is to be found in this world. So what that would lead to then is a pragmatic problem orientation that requires both microscopic and planetary dimensions to account for these interacting force fields invested with differing speeds and degrees of agency. And this is, again, directly against what you were talking about, that there's some stability here in processes. My take on this is that what they're saying is that situations are very complex, but we have to pick and choose priorities in any given circumstance without reference to stable parameters, and it relies then on human exceptionalism to choose wisely, but we're not allowed to have an idea about human exceptionalism in this paradigm. Rather, we should have experimental and speculative action that exceeds our current understandings. Okay? So our consequences could only be conceived retroactively. We don't have prospective consciousness. Why would we? Other animals, plants don't have prospective consciousness. Why would humans? Yes, exactly. There's no orderly relation of cause and effect, which, if you think about what this does ethically, it relieves the burden of accountability for negative consequences. They embrace a philosophy of becoming, shifting elements of ontological uncertainty and real conditioned creativity in the periodic intersections between the several forces in the world. It's another way of saying things are random, we are all becoming. And so we have a Christian version of that, but it's what we're becoming is new creation. And we're not doing that. God is doing that in us. But they want to, again, they've de-godded the world, so what's left? We still have this desire to grow and change, but we don't have any author or any power higher than, well, we can't say we have no power higher than humans because humans are not exceptional. Okay. Okay. We need to recognize the need to supplement current conceptions of reasoning and knowledge with techno-artistic tactics. And this one, I'm okay with. And this one I think that Lewis would be okay with, because what he expressly said this. He's like, you know, what is it? The reason and argument are the province of knowledge, but stories and the imagination are the province of meaning. And so we do need art, and we do need stories. And so And we need to give them the same epistemological value as we give scientific empirical research. So that one I'm okay with. That's pretty much the only one. Let's see what else we've got. And then close attention to the multiple imbrications between regional and global politics and a variety of planetary forces that impinge upon them. And this one's really scary because planetary forces require totalitarian thinking. Otherwise, you have what Pascal says, that truth lies on this one side of the Pyrenees and error on the other. Yeah. Okay. So what I find profoundly sad is that in each tenet, the story that tells its story, the concept that thinks its concept, seems to reach toward elements of the discarded image, Lewis's medieval model, in its desire for a far-off country, but without acknowledging the conditions that informed that image. That is, a transcendent, omnipotent God, or what we moderns would say, an absolute, personal, Trinitarian God who is fundamentally relational and fundamentally loving. But these are the concepts. These are the stories that are telling the stories and the concepts that are thinking the concepts of contemporary literary and cultural theory. Lewis's articulation of the medieval model as an anthroperipheral one can offer a productive starting point for conversations, and as well as for understanding what's behind both the persistent medievalisms in contemporary fantasy worlds that encode desire and the optimistic embrace of new materialism in contemporary theory. And so my final thing, we have to ask ourselves, how do we respond? This is everywhere in the academy. All of my PhD students are enchanted by this theory. They think it will solve the problems that they see. And so we have to think about how we have to respond. And I just have questions. Does new materialist thinking, is that just one more version of the evil enchantments that Lewis lamented? Or does its attempt to render contemporary academics more open to the natural and more than human world offer an opening that they didn't expect, one to which more medieval-minded scholars and more Christian scholars can point the way and lead to a genuine, because God-infused, God-saturated enchantment. So that's what we're left with. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Karen. In our panel, there is still one presentation, but Professor Stanciu could not arrive. I didn't share that information with the speakers, but everyone benefit from extra time. But I would like to have a short time of Q&A. So, first come, first serve. Okay, the microphone somewhere. Thank you. Yeah, we'll bring you.
Thanks very much, Alin. You said that human suffering is undeniable. Wouldn't there be certain philosophical traditions that do deny the existence of suffering? Certain Eastern thought, etc. I mean, they wouldn't call it suffering. They'd say suffering is an illusion, that sort of thing. And is that just not a problem philosophically because we're just working in a Western tradition? Or do Western philosophers consider such an issue?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, you're right. In the Eastern traditions, things would look differently. Yes, I think Buddhism would typically consider suffering an illusion. But I mean, the theodicy problem is a classical product of Western thinking. Right, so it poses itself only within that framework. Because if you think that certain things happen that should not happen, you already have a normative framework that then leads to the question, how can someone who is infinitely good allow these things? If you don't have that normative framework, then the problem as such doesn't pose itself. I personally haven't met anyone who consistently could live that philosophy. Maybe there are people out there, but if you can live that philosophy, then for yourself that's not a problem. But otherwise, it poses itself.
Yeah, I was thinking it more as like philosophically, they would believe, well, I feel like I'm suffering,
Yeah.
but I don't believe in the existence of suffering. I wonder, Karen, if there's any room for suffering in the kind of post or new materialism that you talk about. I mean, I don't see, there's no consciousness as far as I can see, even, you know, that could experience suffering, even though people, I'm sure, who develop these theories are experiencing suffering all the time. But you know, or any reason for a moral obligation to not make animals, for example, suffer, or oil wells, I mean oil deposits, which I have a sort of certain form of consciousness in new materialism usually, and have their own rights and that sort of thing. So you know what I'm saying? It just in terms of the issue of suffering.
Absolutely. This is what's behind a lot of this, is the desire to alleviate suffering, and this is that central concept there, the ethico-onto-epistemology. The claim is, if we just start to think differently about how we are related to the more than human or the non-human world, this will alleviate all of our suffering, because we will be more responsive to things. And I mean, emerging out of this is not just animal studies, but also plant studies.
Well,
so
I
that
heard a whole paper once about
yeah.
consciousness of oil deposits and that sort of thing.
Yep, exactly. And this
they
is
have the rights to be protected from our
right, and how trees, the rhizomatic structure of trees is they're communicating all the time, and that somehow makes humans not exceptional, because we used to say that language was one of the things that we're exceptional in. Well, no, apparently. Trees drop baby trees and have rhizomatic structures where they're constantly communicating with themselves and the others. And I'm not going to deny that any of this science is true or exists, but I think then our ethics have to come from somewhere else. So in other words, just changing the way we think and imagining ourselves to be ontologically inseparable from the rest of matter in the world. The ethical component of that is contingent, because it's not going to make us behave better toward those things. And that means that our ethical, they don't have a framework that is convincing in terms of how we respond ethically, even if we think differently, even if we imagine ourselves differently. Our ethics come from a transcendental subject, and that subject is the Lord, and it's foundational.
I really appreciate the attention to something like discarded image, or that sort of thing, and pre-modern. So a pre-modern understanding, or a nativist understanding, which can address some of these issues, or at least give common ground for discussion about a much better relationship to what we would call nature, or whatever.
Absolutely, because part of the thing is recovering indigenous knowledges, and IDK, it's called, indigenous knowledge. They're trying to think about the ways in which we can be more responsive to environmental facticity, I guess. But again, the desire to do that is contingent on it's not built into the system. It's not necessary in the philosophical terms. It requires some other foundation.
If I may add to that, philosophy, there's still the famous is-ought gap, and it hasn't been closed. And you were talking about new discoveries in science, so new facts. But new facts don't give us any new ought. And so however many facts you gather how many new perspectives you gain on nature. It doesn't tell you what ought to be the case. And this is such a foundational problem that I don't see any way to close that gap unless you already assume a moral dimension to the world, but that is non-empirical. That doesn't depend on science. It depends on other ways of knowledge. So I don't see any way how these new materialists could even come close to that unless they enchant people with their fancy terms and just blur differences.
I would like to ask questions of all three of you and have about an hour discussion with each of you, but this probably isn't the forum to do this. Karen, I would just like to ask you, when you talk about this speculative action, it seems to me that's a little bit like Mao's Great Leap Forward. It's not dependent on anything except what his idea was. There was no science behind it, and it resulted in the deaths of millions of people. Or some of our response to COVID, which we didn't know the science, and so we just tell everybody you have to do this or that or the other thing. And it seems to me that it's a really scary thing because that's in the hand of totalitarian people. Then you'll say, okay, well, we can't plant crops, or we can't dig for oil, or and it just make everybody poorer and hungrier, and you'll be right, there'll be less suffering because everybody will be dead. Would you comment on that, please?
Okay, first of all, the genealogy of this thinking starts in Marxist theory. It is a neo-Marxist perspective. So you're not wrong about this, and it does require, and I was talking at breakfast this morning, I've invented a new term. I call it hipster piety, because it is, if you think, hipster piety, because it is a religion. And I mean, it is a new master. It is a new master discourse. It's a new religion, and it is constantly changing. They keep moving the goalpost, which is, whatever's trending, is what we need to believe and we need to accept. And all of the things that you just said, you see governments insisting, like governments in the Netherlands, telling people what they can plant and what they can't. And all kinds of things are happening around the world. In the United States, you can't, we need to protect this piece of land. We can't drill here, we can't do this. And it requires that kind of heavy-handed totalitarianism to think about this on a planetary dimension. And it will make people poorer, and it will increase suffering. And Donna Haraway is not holding back when she says make kin, not babies. We need to reduce the population, according to a lot these people, according to some of these theorists, that they are anti-population growth.
Strangely enough, many of them, though, resist the idea of dying until they're like really old, like 50.
Well, I mean, think about, well, I'm not going to go to the dark place with COVID, but go ahead. I'm just going to...
I have a question for Melody. You were explaining about aporia and the concept of reason begins there when you have that moment of being disarmed before the other. So do either of these systems, what C.S. Lewis's or Derrida's, allow for authority being your source of knowing or reason, I guess?
That's a really good question. Lewis definitely gives space for authority. Just a second. But could you repeat the question? Because I think I heard two questions in that, and I'm not sure.
Maybe there is, but I guess I heard you saying that reason begins there with that moment of being disarmed before the other.
Let's see.
Based
yes.
on aporia. And you kind of compared it to C.S. Lewis with the idea wonder. And I do think Lewis came to God through a romantic, let's just say, road.
Right.
But-
So, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I guess, does Lewis acknowledge another path where people come through an authority, like Pascal talking about the authority of God's word, for example?
So I would word that a little differently, that it's not that Lewis thought everybody had to come to faith through wonder at all. That in fact, somewhere in Surprised by Joy, and I'm sure there's somebody here who can tell me, somewhere in Surprised by Joy, he actually says something about, my story is actually kind of unusual, and other people have other paths that they come to Christ. So I think he would definitely leave room for authority. He would definitely leave room for other methods of coming to know who Christ is. Does that help?
But Derrida would not?
Derrida doesn't come to Christ, so he would, he would.
Even for meaning, I guess. For where would reason start?
He would say that authority would be one of the structures that it could be the center, and then a new authority becomes the new center, and a new authority becomes the new center. He would probably associate, I would say he would associate authority with whatever the current center is.
Okay, I understand. Thanks. That helps.
I would like to intervene, so because time is up. Question will continue during break. I saw Denise Vasiliou's eyes, so I understood all her talk to me, so I need to end this session now. But after this very important panel and fruitful, we need to thank to our speakers and to continue the debates also for, with a coffee, with a tea, or just with a break. Thank you. In a few minutes we will be back here for the final session.